everybody. Welcome back to Book 4 of the Royal Ranger series, The Missing Prince. Today we're in Chapter 3, so let's go ahead and get into it. So, King Philippe, tell us, how can we help you? It was the morning after the Gallican party's midnight arrival at Castle Araluen, and Philippe and his brother were in Duncan's office. Also present were Anthony, the Chamberlain, and a tall, broad-shouldered warrior who had been introduced as Sir Horace, Duncan's son-in-law, and the commander of the Araluen army. They were seated around Duncan's large table. A sixth man, dressed in a curious green and gray mottled cloak, sat to one side as if trying to remain unobtrusive. Philippe had to turn his head to see him. He had been introduced as Gillen, the commandant of the Araluen Rangers. As far as Philippe was concerned, this man was the key reason for their presence here, and he kept turning to watch the still figure. "It's my son, Giles," Philippe said, coming straight to the point. "He's being held hostage by one of my barons." Duncan inclined his head thoughtfully. This was serious news, and it didn't bode well for Gallica, a country with a notoriously unstable political history, prone to revolts and quarreling among its ruling class. Philippe had ruled over this turbulent situation for the past 9 years, having seized the throne in an uprising of his own. On the other hand, it was not entirely bad news for Araluen. When Gallica was torn by internal strife, it posed little threat to other countries. Many years past, the large and potentially powerful nation had been an aggressive and unpredictable state, threatening the peace of its neighbors and seeking to conquer new territories. But the current internal instability meant the Gallicans were too consumed by their own problems to look outside their own borders. "How did this happen?" Duncan asked. "And who is the baron in question?" "His name is Licini, Baron Joubert de Licini. His castle is the Chateau des Falaises. It's a powerful fortress," Philippe told them. Duncan threw a quick sidelong glance at Anthony. The Chamberlain nodded discreetly. He had heard of Joubert de Licini. It was part of his job to gather intelligence about ambitious nobles in Araluen and overseas who might pose a potential threat to the current peace. "And you say this man kidnapped your son?" Duncan continued. "Nothing so blatant," Philippe said. "It was more that he took advantage of a situation as it arose. My son was hunting in Licini's province when a violent storm blew up. He and his party sought shelter in the Chateau des Falaises. Unfortunately, Giles is young and didn't appreciate that Licini has ambitions for greater power. By placing himself into his hands, he has given him enormous leverage to advance his own position and power." Anthony leaned forward. "Has Licini made any direct threat against your son?" Philippe shook his head with a bitter smile. "He's too clever for that. If he made a direct threat, he knows I would be able to seek support from the other barons and force him to release Giles. As it is, he says that Giles has decided to remain at Chateau des Falaises indefinitely, of his own will. The other barons are prepared to accept that at face value and stay out of the argument. None of them are particularly loyal to the crown," he said scornfully. "It's a strong fortress, and my own forces aren't sufficient to besiege it and take it. I would need 4 times as many men as I have for that. And if I were to attack Licini, it might well create a revolt among some of the others. I know several of them are looking for any excuse to rise up against me." Has Licini made any direct demands from you? Horace put the question. Has he set a price for the release of your son? Again the king of Gallica shook his head. Nothing direct. For several years now, he has been agitating for the control of the province adjacent to his own. The baron who had control of that province died some years ago, and Licini has had his eye on it ever since. He paused, and his brother took up the narrative. The dead baron had no heir, and Licini has laid a claim to the land, Louis said. It's a rich province, and it will give him even greater power than he has now. But surely the king can appoint whomever he chooses as baron of that province, Horace asked. He knew that would be the case in Ereluen, but not, apparently, in Gallica. I wish it were so, Philippe told him, but Licini has a claim to the position, albeit a thin one. 100 years ago, the two provinces formed one barony. They were divided by one of my predecessors, probably because they created a powerful base that might threaten his position. There are members of the Council of Barons who support Licini's claim. Doubtless, they expect some form of reward should his claim be recognized. And purely by coincidence, he has raised this claim again, just at the time that your son has fallen into his hands, Duncan said. Philippe turned to look at him. Exactly. The message is unstated, but perfectly clear for all that. Give him the title to the neighboring province, and Giles will be allowed to return home. I can see your problem, Duncan said thoughtfully, but I'm not sure what help we can give you. We can hardly send troops to Gallica to reinforce your authority over Licini. That would be too big a provocation for the other barons. You've said that many of them tacitly support him. That's right. That our sending troops to help you could spark a revolt among them, and even a war between our two countries. I'm not prepared to risk that for something that's essentially an internal Gallican problem. He frowned, then continued. I don't want to sound unsympathetic to your needs, but I know how our barons would react if I asked for Gallican troops to help support me. He glanced around the room at his counselors, who nodded their agreement. I'm not asking for troops. I'm not asking you to fight my battle for me. This is not a situation that can be resolved by force. It needs guile and subterfuge, possibly one man. One man? Horace interposed. Who might that be? Philippe spread his hands in a slightly perplexed gesture. I have no particular man in mind, he said. That would be for you to decide and to recommend. I don't follow, Duncan said. You feel one man might be able to solve your problem, but you don't know who he is. You're speaking in riddles, Philippe. There was an edge of anger in his voice. Gallicans seemed to find a perverse enjoyment in being abstruse. Philippe recognized it and made a conciliatory gesture. I don't mean to be obscure, he said. It's more a type of man that I think could solve the problem. He twisted in his chair to look directly at Gillen. One of your rangers, perhaps. Gillen was unsurprised. His face remained impassive. What do you know about our rangers? Philippe shrugged. They have a certain reputation, he said. A reputation for getting things done, without necessarily resorting to brute force. It's said they can achieve the impossible. It's also said that we're wizards, who practice the dark arts to achieve our ends, Gillen said. But neither statement is true. The simple fact is, my men are carefully selected, highly intelligent, and well trained. They can fight when necessary, but they use their brains first to try to avoid fighting. And that's the sort of man this situation needs, Philippe said. Falaise is a powerful castle. It could withstand a siege for years, even if I had the men and the support necessary to mount such a siege. But one man, using guile and subterfuge and intelligence, might be able to penetrate the castle and bring Giles out. Duncan cleared his throat to interrupt. He wasn't sure he liked the way this conversation was going. The Rangers were a very special resource. They had been founded to keep the peace in Erluin, and to serve the Erluin king's needs. They were not intended to be hired out to other countries. "One point I would like to make," he said. "The Rangers are tasked with serving the king. They're known as King's Rangers, after all." Louis smiled unctuously. "And my brother is a king." Duncan's brows drew together. Sometimes Gallicans could be altogether too glib, he thought. "He's not their king," he said brusquely. Philippe responded with a typically Gallic shrug of the shoulders. "That's true, of course, but there is a brotherhood among kings, surely. And after all, a threat to one royal family is a threat to all. If it goes unchecked in Gallica, it could encourage others here as well." There was a certain amount of truth in what he was saying, but Duncan wasn't totally convinced. Events in Gallica had no real bearing on the situation in Erluin. Yes, Duncan was realistic enough to know that, while his kingdom was at peace and relatively stable, there was always undercurrents of resentment and intrigue in any realm. "Perhaps," he allowed grudgingly. He let his gaze travel around the room, looking for some reaction from Anthony and the others. Their expressions told him they were not convinced one way or the other. "I'll need to confer with my advisers," he told the Gallican king. "I'll give you my decision tonight." Philippe bowed gracefully, despite his seated position. "That's all I can ask," he said smoothly. After Philippe and his brother had returned to their quarters, Duncan faced his three counselors. "Well, what do you think?" he asked. They exchanged glances. None of them seemed willing to speak first. He prompted his son-in-law. "Horace?" The tall warrior shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I'm not sure it's any of our business," he said eventually. "Much as I dislike the idea of anyone holding a hostage and giving out demands for his return, it seems to me it's a Gallican matter, one they should resolve themselves. Morally, I disapprove of Licini's actions, but practically, I'm not sure we should get involved, and it's not as if we owe Philippe any favors." "Quite so," Duncan agreed, "and Philippe has never been a particularly friendly neighbor, has he? This situation could be largely his own doing." "What makes you say that, my lord?" Gillen asked. The king shrugged and gestured to his chamberlain. "You tell them, Anthony." Lord Anthony cleared his throat and gathered his thoughts before speaking. While the Ranger Corps was responsible for keeping the king informed of potential threats or trouble within Erluin itself, Anthony maintained a network of secret agents on the continental landmass, in Gallica, Teutland, and Iberion particularly. They reported to him on a regular basis, keeping him up to date with events and political affairs that might impact Erluin. "He's a weak king," Anthony said eventually. "He's never been one to assert his authority over his barons. He rules by keeping them at each other's throats, and he is known to accept bribes for royal favors. Consequently, Gallica has been an unstable kingdom for years, riddled with factions and corruption. The current situation is probably largely due to his own weakness and indecisiveness. Licini has seen an opportunity and has seized it." What do we know about Licini? Horace asked. He could be a problem, Anthony told him. He's aggressive and ambitious, and quite obviously not too concerned about how he achieves his ends. He's got a strong garrison at Falaise, and a large militia to draw on. And, as King Philippe told us, he's got the support of some of the other barons. Just how ambitious do you think he is? Duncan asked. Anthony paused thoughtfully as he considered the question. I would guess he wants more than control of the 2 provinces. From what I've heard of him, I'd say that's a means to an end. What end? Duncan asked, although he felt he knew the answer already. In my opinion, he wants to take the throne. He has the power and the support of the other barons, doubtless bought with promises of a reward if he's successful. He's taking a big risk holding the king's son hostage. He has to be looking for more than just control of another province. What about Philippe's claim that an attack on one royal family is an attack on all? Horace asked. Anthony spread his hands, shaking his head. He may well see it that way, he replied. He tends to believe that he is king by some divine right. You, sir, he said, nodding toward Duncan, hold your position and rank due to your own merits. The people are loyal to you because they respect you. Duncan allowed himself the faintest smile. Most of them, perhaps, he said. But I tend to agree. Rebellion in Gallica won't necessarily lead to the same happening here. He turned to Gillen. What do you think of sending a ranger to help? The commandant screwed up his face in an expression of distaste. I don't like it, he said. The Corps was founded to operate mainly inside Erluen, and for your benefit, sir, he said, I'm not too comfortable with outsiders getting to know more and more about us. We've tried to maintain a low profile over the years, and I don't like to see that slip away. Duncan nodded. I tend to agree. I don't like the idea of sending a ranger to help Philippe. It's a little too close to treating the Corps as mercenaries for hire. We've used rangers in the past to help the Scandians, and the Eridans, Anthony pointed out. They're friends and allies, Duncan replied immediately. We have treaties with them, and they give back as much as they get. Philippe, on the other hand, has generally treated us with disdain, until now, when he needs our help. There is something else to consider, Anthony said. It's probably in our best interest to make sure Philippe retains his throne. He paused, and Duncan made a gesture for him to continue with the thought. Philippe is a weak king, and Gallica is divided and fragmented. Licini, on the other hand, would be a strong king. He'd unite the barons, and he'd create stability within Gallica. Surely that's to the good, Horace asked. But Anthony shook his head. He's ambitious and unscrupulous, he said. If he gained power, he might look to expand his borders. He might have to, in fact, if he were to repay the other barons who supported him in usurping the throne. You're saying he could be a threat to Erluen? Duncan asked. Anthony nodded slowly. Certainly more of a threat than Philippe poses. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. At length, Duncan broke it. Then it might be in our best interest to do as Philippe is asking. All right, that's going to bring us to the end of chapter number 3. As always, I want to thank everyone for joining me. Thank you for listening, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time in chapter 4. God bless, and have a good one.